Okay. All right. Play. Okay. Welcome to Composition Beyond the Rule of Thirds. Now, there are no rules because photography is a creative art, but there are plenty of compositional tools, many of which you probably know. A speaker can be more effective if he has an understanding of grammatical rules and conventions. A photographer can work without understanding the fundamentals of visual language, but his or her work will be stronger with an understanding of them. In simplest terms, composition is arranging elements within the frame so that a viewer can understand your message. Composition is one of the most crucial skills to develop in photography. Unlike the weather and natural light, it is totally under your control because you are the one who's organizing the image. Now, technical aspects such as how to use your camera, how to use light, they're all important, but you need a balance of technique with intuition and creativity. Successful photographs are not from what you know, but how you use what you know. Anyone can take a picture. Without design, there may be representation, but there can be no art. Some people say these tools are too confining, that they restrict their creativity, but really they help to execute it and communicate your photographic message. Good photographers are close observers. Through an internal thought process of what they're aiming to say, they make deliberate choices about what to include in the frame and what to eliminate. And then they use the various fundamentals to get their message across. Dorothea Lange, who was a photographer in the late 30s, was very observant. On the left, you see a woman who has a dirty child and, God forbid, a Coke bottle that she had to use to feed her kid. So from that, you feel how hard it must be for that woman. On the right, there's an abandoned farm in the Dust Bowl. She included the dead crops and all that surrounding desolate land to get her point across. Our brains are great at zeroing in on an object and filtering out everything around it. We prioritize what we find interesting and we don't notice what surrounds it. That's how we miss the tree growing out of somebody's head. A viewer needs to be able to figure out what we thought was important. So you have to make a conscious effort to look around the frame to see everything. What is this image about? The rose? Well, then why not that image? So there are many elements to composition, and we will explore most of these tonight. The first fundamental is to simplify. A good composition is equal to a single sentence. It's compelling, concise, and well constructed. A bad composition is a whole string of sentences or ideas, and the sentence gets lost. How many times have you looked at an image and the photographer started to explain it or tell how hard it was to get the shot? The image should speak for itself. This is a very documentary shot. What's the idea being conveyed? Who knows? The more you include, the harder it is to figure out why you took the picture. There's an awful lot here. The boats must be the subject, but you see the yellow in the back, the brown trees in the reflection, the white boat masts, the mountains or hills behind. Should they be part of the frame? They actually dilute the story and make it hard to figure out the point of this image, which is isolation and calmness. The more you simplify, the more attention you draw to your subject, and the easier it is for someone to figure out why you took the picture. So eliminate anything that doesn't contribute to your subject. Simplicity is about subtracting the obvious and adding the meaningful. The camera captures everything in front of it, so you need to be deliberate about what you include. What's this image about? Well, obviously there's I guess it's a snorkeler, it's a woman. She has a blue starfish in her hand, but she's also got some yellow stuff, which is really drawing your eye away from her. So there's an awful lot there that makes you wonder. This is all you need to tell the story of the blue starfish. You can still see it's a snorkeler who found it, and it's immaterial whether it was a male or female. Think of yourself as a sculptor. Your job is to whittle away the extraneous to get to the heart of your image. Taking color out of it is one way to simplify. Now, the human brain has a conditioned response to certain visual information. Long ago, we learned to react to clues about threats, food, even human interaction. By knowing these responses, you can use them to draw attention to a subject or to be aware of what will distract from your subject. Here are 8 of these responses. The first is a human figure. We quickly see other figures, whether by shape, face, or eyes. I guarantee that even though that guy in the back there is pretty darn little, you saw him pretty quickly. So if you don't want that to draw attention, you need to minimize it in some way or get rid of it. In our modern world, we have been conditioned to respond to text. If there are any letters or numbers, our eyes are drawn to them quickly. I guarantee that when this image came up, your eye went from Lincoln quickly up to the text. Be aware of any text in your frame. It should contribute to the story. Here, Dorothea Lange included the sign as an ironic caption to these poor guys who are walking cross country looking for work. Next time, try the train, relax. Yeah, right. Oops. My finger got happy there. Watch for text that may have some significance, whether good or bad. This couple is standing in front of a brothel sign, and with that grin on his face, it looks like he's just picked her up and he's pretty happy. Actually, that's my brother and his future wife. But think of a politician with a movie marquee behind him that says the Joker. Make sure that any text is appropriate to the message you're trying to convey. Now, this may seem obvious, but we notice large objects before we see small ones. This can be overlooked. If your subject is small, having something large near it will compete with it. Here's a double whammy. There's text and it's a large sign. So you really, and plus the numbers are kind of shocking. And this was in 2011, south of Death Valley. You don't bother to go back to see what's back in the background. We notice bright objects or areas before dark ones, and this is great when you want something to stand out, but not so great when it shouldn't be part of the scene. Minimize it or hide it because our eyes will go straight to it. We notice sharp things first. Our brain equates sharpness with importance, so it's critical for your subject to be sharp to help to identify it. Here are 2 of my grandkids. Bet it took you a while to see the boy on the right. He's not sharp, she is. Plus he's a little bit in shadow. We notice things that we recognize first. Again, this seems obvious, but it can be overlooked. Remember this image from earlier? Well, the rose seems to be the subject, but we recognize the leaves behind it and the car. So they immediately draw our eyes away from the rose. The photographer should have shot from a different angle or used a shallower depth of field, and probably zoomed in a bit too. We notice warm colors before cool ones. Warm colors seem to come forward and cool ones seem to recede. We also notice saturated ones before pastels. Basically, this has to do with contrast. Your eye probably went quickly to the red building at the bottom. And here it goes to the yellow because it's brighter and warmer. And the last response is emotional significance. Any visual element that we have an emotional attachment to will get noticed way faster than with other elements. If there's a group picture with someone you care about in it, you'll quickly find them. And this is, of course, individually subjective, but it applies whether it's a person, event, or location. Now, while you don't have to memorize these responses, it's good to be able to recognize them. Now, on the left is a documentary shot with an awful lot to take your attention away from the bridal couple. Now that you know about the human responses, let's see why. Well, there are human beings behind them, and you have to check them out to see if there's anybody there that you know. There's a red dress on the right, so you notice that right off the bat. There's also enough of the bamboo that you can see and recognize to that's flanking the group to recognize it. And for all those reasons, you have to explore the background before noticing the couple. On the right, with those distractions removed, they're now the star of the image. Now we're at subject placement. Each element in your frame has a relationship to the other things there. Remember that we are taking an image of a three-dimensional world that will be shown in a two-dimensional image. Where you place the objects can make a profound difference. Let's say you're in Rome at the Colosseum and you want to take a picture of your family there. Well, you have a decision to make. What's more important, the Colosseum or the people? If they're standing next to the building and you back away to get all of it in, they'll be so tiny that no one will know who they are. If you want them to be prominent in the image, place them closer to you with the building in the background. Now, one guideline of placement is the rule of thirds, which you're all familiar with. And this was created so that subjects weren't placed smack in the center where so many beginners place them. But why has this become the rule? Well, scientific studies show that center and corners are areas of visual gravity. They act as magnets to pull objects toward them. So if you place an object near one of these areas, it's unconsciously perceived as being pulled toward the magnet, and that gives energy to the image. If you place a subject in the center, it's perceived as stuck there, unable to move because it's on the strongest magnet, and that prompts the brain to figure that it's not worthy of attention. Place elements between these magnets to create a visual tension, which will keep the viewer's interest longer. Now notice that where the grid lines of the rule of thirds are, none touch the magnetic areas. Having the subject in the center means that you're giving equal importance to both halves. These sunflowers are centered both vertically and horizontally. The sky isn't important here, and below them is nothing of importance, so a better way to take this shot is to move them lower in the frame and get rid of that sky. For a landscape, where you place the horizon depends on where the story is. If the sky is spectacular, make that the larger part. If the sky is bland, minimize it or get rid of it altogether. Now here the sky is dramatic, so why not have more of it? Well, the photographer chose this positioning for two reasons. Number one, there are leading lines that point your eye up to that butte. And number two is the bottom of any frame has a certain amount of weight because of gravity. So placing the subject higher in the frame creates tension, which gives the subject visual importance. If you choose to do this, don't have a large empty area with nothing of interest in the foreground. Here's another spatial guideline called the golden spiral, and it's based on the ratio of phi, which is 1 to 1.618. Not that that means anything to us, but the phi grid, which is in red, is based on that relationship as well. Now, art was supposedly based on this ratio because it was thought that humans find beauty in things that correspond to it. The spiral, I think, is extremely hard to visualize when composing. This is a pretty good shot that takes that into consideration. So is this one. But it's much easier to use the phi grid. Note that the lines are closer together into the center than the rule of thirds. Here's another placement concern. Do you want your subject on the left or the right? In our Western world, we read from left to right, and it's thought that we enter a photo from the left. So if a subject is on the left side of the image, a viewer may perceive that they've reached the climax, so there's no reason to continue. If you flip the image, a viewer will move across from the left, coming to the flower on the right. I don't know about entering the photo from the left. It doesn't seem to work for me, but for some reason, having the subject on the right feels more comfortable. Now here, which image do you prefer? This involves the two hemispheres of the brain, the left and right. They think and see differently. 90% of viewers find the left one to be more appealing. Its leading lines go from the lower left to the upper right, which stimulates the left half of the brain, which is in charge of analytic and logical thought, so it understands lines. There's also a belief that we perceive that lines going from the lower left to the upper right are moving upward, indicating power and positive emotions, while those going from upper left to lower right are moving downward, giving a sense of subtlety, calmness, and even melancholy. Negative space. It surrounds the subject and helps to define it. It can be empty, but it doesn't have to be. Positive space is the subject itself. Here, it's the area surrounding the bicyclists. They're small, so all that negative space gives the feeling of how vast and desolate it is there. This boat is surrounded by a lot of negative space that's filled with fog, and that creates a feeling of isolation and loneliness. If this were cropped in tighter around that ship, it wouldn't have that same feeling. Most times you don't want to use so much negative space, but most beginners include way too much. In this image, is all that space surrounding these people necessary? It's just empty sand, bunch of water, and big sky. Certainly doesn't contribute to the story. You don't get the feeling of isolation because they're smiling. Filling the frame makes it obvious that the subject is the family. You can still tell that they're at a beach, but now you can actually see them. So a filled frame helps to simplify and identify the subject. Now we come to the frame within the frame. This adds context, meaning, and/or depth to an image. So keep your eye out for objects that you can look through at your subject. This is a documentary shot, nothing special. But by moving across the street into a barn, I used its doorway to add the frame to add some depth and interest. And notice that the top of the frame echoes the roof line of the building. That was just serendipity. On the left is a documentary shot that shows this young girl in tribal dress. And on the right, she's framed by the woman's arms. And that helps to make the viewer feel involved, keep their interest longer. Frame can take many forms. Here's a triangle of railings and roofline that encapsulate the man. Lines may be very simple, but they're very powerful. They suggest moods, rhythms, create patterns, indicate direction. When a viewer sees a line, he or she is compelled to follow it. Horizontal lines lend a calm feeling to an image. They suggest constancy and stability. Human vision tends to work on the horizontal, so this is a reassuring format, unless it's of a tiger about to pounce. They give a sense of timelessness, balance, and harmony. Usually, horizontal lines should be shot in landscape mode unless you want to have a unique perspective. And one thing to note, horizons are meant to be horizontal, totally level, unless you really intend to convey an uneasy feeling. Vertical lines equal power, strength, and vitality, and shooting in a vertical format stresses depth and/or height. Think tall trees, waterfalls, buildings. This format differs from our normal horizon or horizontal vision, so it offers a different perspective than people normally see, which can make your image stand out. Typically, vertical lines should be shot in portrait mode to emphasize their length, but there are always exceptions. Shooting them in a horizontal frame can actually increase the sense of vastness by making it seem as if those lines are too tall to be captured in a single frame. Diagonal lines create motion and energy. They can feel unbalanced and appear to be unstable, so there's a sense of drama to it. Think about walking through a forest and you see a tree leaning. Because it's on a diagonal, it could be ready to fall on you, which creates tension. Diagonals create a sense of depth because of the appearance of diminishing size. This is a more interesting image with them on a diagonal than if they were all lined up straight and level. Mixing line types creates a nice blend of power and dynamics. But be careful of too many lines because it can look chaotic and create tension. Curved lines create a sense of movement. They cause the viewer to slow down, to wander through your image. This stream is a curved line that pulls you in on the left. You explore along its curved line until you get to the mountains in the back. Lines don't have to be actual lines, they can be implied. Here, note the two men on the right looking at the couple kissing. When you see them looking, you have to see where they're looking, and that creates an implied line of sight. Here's another line of sight, implied line. Leading lines are one of the simplest ideas in composition, yet they're very powerful. They draw your viewer into the image, lead them on a journey through it, and ultimately point them to some kind of visual payoff. Here, the edges of the road lead to the mountains and the wild-looking sky. The trick is learning to see lines that lead to something important, usually the subject. Here, the line of the stream points to nothing of interest. Here, the fence leads you straight back to the figure in the distance. Diagonals or curves are great leading lines. They break up the rectangular frame of our photos, which adds energy to an image. Even shadows can be leading lines. These are subtle, but they're effective. Now we get to color, which can be a dominant element of a composition, but too many colors look chaotic. The more you simplify them, the better. This image must be about umbrellas because there's so many of them, but there are just so many colors that there's no cohesion or harmony to it. This image is way more effective because of its limited color palette. In the days of black and white, every image had to stand on its own merits. A red rose, for example, was not automatically thought of as a passionate shot because there was no color involved. You had to stop and think what made a rose appear as passionate, then use the principles of design to give that sense. When color is available, it's easy to let it do the work for you. But unless color is the star of the show, it should be a supporting actor. You should become familiar with the color wheel. Colors opposite on this wheel are called complementary colors. We think of them as contrasting: purple, yellow, green, red, blue, orange. Analogous colors are those that are beside each other. So here we've got yellow. The analogous colors to it are a light yellow green and a light orange yellow. This little girl was purposely dressed in yellow to contrast with the purple flowers, since they're complementary. When setting up a group shot, you'll get a better look if all the members dress in complementary or analogous colors. And of course, you'd want to have them against a harmonious background as well. Colors have a language of their own, which does differ from one culture to another, but they can have a significant impact on the emotional reaction of a viewer, evoking feelings and affecting the mood of a photograph. This is blue to give you a sense of how cold this place really is. This photo was taken to illustrate a story about a serial killer. The vast amount of red indicates danger. The green pillow contrasts that by giving you a false sense of serenity, but then it's smashed by the skeleton. If this was in black and white, it would not have the same effect on you. When colors are close together, they have an effect on each other. Here's a red line surrounded by yellow. Now remember, while these are tertiary colors, which are separated by several colors on the wheel, more than the analogous colors. Now, see the red line with the complementary color, green. It looks way more vibrant, so vibrant that it appears to vibrate. So what's this mean? Well, you can create impact by having certain colors together. This is a rather drab photo. Red car against a sort of orange-brown, yuck. But you change that background to green, and now you have one that pops. When juxtaposed, complementary colors make each other seem brighter and more vivid. Here's an insect against a rather dull background. It's an okay shot, but this one really pops. Now there's also the absence of color. The best time to think about doing black and white is when you're composing, not as an afterthought. You can't save a crappy image by turning it into black and white. Because of the absence of color, you must think about lines, shapes, textures, and light. Now in the 1920s, a group of psychologists developed these Gestalt principles that try to explain how we perceive things and organize them. So let's see how they relate to photography. First up is visual weight and balance. Everything in an image takes up space. Visual weight is affected by placement, size, color, and contrast. This is a steelyard balance. It balances objects of different sizes and weights by their position from the fulcrum point. And that's what visual weight is based on. If you have two identical objects that are equidistant from the fulcrum point, they're balanced. If you move one farther away from the fulcrum point, it becomes unbalanced. Two objects of differing sizes will still be balanced if the smaller one is farther from the center and the larger one is closer to it. If you have one large object on one side, it's balanced by multiple objects on the other side if they are of approximately the same size. Now here's something that may be totally new to you. Dark areas have more weight than light ones. So even though this cupcake is smaller than the cake, they have the same visual weight. These cakes may be identically sized, but they have different visual weight because one is dark and one is light. Now, because red is a commanding color and it's darker, the cupcake here has the same visual weight as a yellow cake. Keep these things in mind when you're composing your image. Here the giraffe is smack in the middle. Thinking of this only in terms of visual weight, this is not balanced because there's more dark area on the right than the left. By moving him over, he is now in a much lighter area. And on the right, there's more darkness here, down here, and we've got this dark cloud up there. So that's now balanced. So if one side of an image is darker than the other, balance it with a larger, lighter area on the opposite side. The outside on the sign on the right is about the same size as the building, and they're the same distance from each edge. So this is balanced. You can achieve balance by using colors. Here the same area of vibrant, or the small area of vibrant color balances the larger area of the cooler colors. Now, achieving balance is not an absolute rule, but it does help to give a sense of serenity, stability, and harmony. So if unbalanced is what you want, then just do the opposite. Now, here is a centered shot that is balanced, but it is not symmetrical, but it is pretty cool because it is balanced. And if you have a portrait, you can center the subject In a close-up shot, where they occupy most or all of the frame, just place their eyes approximately on the upper third line and the mouth in the lower third. Now, symmetry creates balance, usually with a subject that has two identical sides. Sometimes that can be boring, so look for ways to shake it up. Here, we've got this big flag down at the bottom, and there are two people on the left side. So that creates just a little bit of tension. Symmetry equals perfect balance. So you have to be very aware of it being dead center and not off by even a degree, or it will be distracting. Blue line shows the exact center of the frame, so you can see that this is tilted by about 7 or 8 degrees. Reflections are great candidates for symmetry. Now, the second Gestalt principle is called figure ground. Our brains want to differentiate a form from its surroundings. The subject is the figure and the surrounding area is the ground. This is where your background comes into play. It is as important as your subject because it needs to support the subject, not distract from it. This one is extremely clean and simple. Some people might say, well, they want the background to show context, and that's fine for some scenarios. But a viewer needs to be able to find a subject without a lot of effort. This bird merges right into that background. Here, you see him right off the bat. Now on the left, you see the grass through the slats of the bench. So the grass and the bench become one entity, one figure. On the right, you can clearly see the space between the slats, so that bench stands out on its own. And that's what you want. On the left, the man is separated from the column, and his shadow is separated from the column's shadow. Plus, at the end, it doesn't, where's my cursor? It doesn't touch the shadow of the roof here either. If he were closer to the column or farther back, he would have created a form that was not him. He would have merged with those shadows. On the right, the man is surrounded by light, which makes him stand out from his surroundings. If he were in shadow, he would not have been as distinct, which would have taken away impact. So be aware of where you're placing your subject and what's surrounding it. Here, the white dock is surrounded by darker water, even at the upper end. If that end had touched the lighter sky, it would have become one shape with the dock. Without that clear separation, it wouldn't be as strong an image. Now here is an environmental shot, but there's so much going on in the background. There's too many recognizable things, all distracting from the couple. By removing just the human figures, it makes it so much better. If a background is complicated, the viewer is compelled to explore it. So do whatever it takes to get rid of a background that distracts. The third Gestalt concept is shapes. They add interest to your image. We identify things by shape so our eyes are drawn to them. Here's an organic S-curve, which makes a great abstract. One of the most powerful shapes is a triangle. It has 3 corners, which create an arrow pointing which way the eye should go. In this image, there's lots of triangles. There's the rock in the lower right corner. In the water, there's a large triangle of submerged rocks pointing to the back. Then there's the 2 tree sections and the sky. They're all forming triangles to that back point. You can create a shape by positioning elements into a shape. The rock in the foreground and the sea stacks in the back form a triangle that keeps the viewer's eye moving around those 3 areas. Oops. There are all kinds of shapes out there. Look for them. The next Gestalt principle is proximity and grouping. When objects are close together, we see them as a group that has a shape all its own. The 36 dots that are close together on the left form a rectangle. Those same 36 dots being separated form 3 columns. So this can come in handy when you're faced with trying to shoot a whole lot of objects. Here, the photographer was surrounded by ferns, so he looked for a group to create a shape. He framed the ferns with the trees and the creek, and then used the break to form a grouping of ferns in the center. And this served to create 3 layers: the foreground, middle ground, and background. Proximity is the reason for mergers. Since we see in 3 dimensions, we may not notice how the camera will change the perspective in 2 dimensions. So again, we have to consciously look around the frame and notice everything. A subgroup of proximity is the rule of odds. Odd numbers of objects seem to be more appealing than even numbers. Think of lucky numbers, 7, 11, and 3 is a very popular number. 3 Musketeers, 3 blind mice, 3 stooges, on and on. Using an odd number creates a visual balance, a harmonious pattern that is very effective. Another subgroup is continuity. As we've seen, a viewer has an instinctive tendency to follow a line, whether it's a path, a river, or a beach. So unless you have a good reason not to, give a subject room to follow that implied line. This poor eagle is about to crash into that frame. At least that's the feeling. Giving him space to move into creates a sense of implied motion and feels way more comfortable. This car is clearly moving to the right, so space on the right gives us a sense of travel. Without space to move into, this subject feels like it's caged. The sense of movement is diminished. If there's a person looking to one side, give them space in the direction that they're looking. Now here's an image, the antithesis of that last thought. This guy is looking out of the frame and he's close to the edge. That creates tension, which creates interest. You wonder what he's looking at. Like I said, there's no absolutes. Our brains are wired to recognize patterns, which involves similarity. Elements that have similar characteristics will often be viewed as a grouped pattern. Repetition, especially with slight variations, can be visually interesting. This builds on the proximity grouping principle. Here we've got a line of viewers and one woman, but they all form a pattern. The image on the left is just chaotic. It's documentary. The birds are all over the place, going in different directions. Any similarity ends at them all being geese. On the right, though, this image has some repetition and rhythm. All the geese are going in the same direction, and they all have a reflection. Effective use of patterns is to show a break in the repetition, like this girl in the row of lockers, plus her green in the row of orange. Think of a line of cars, all black except for one red one. How about a crowd of people with one guy going the opposite way? Here's a simple repetition of shapes and colors. The last Gestalt principle I'll mention is closure. You don't have to include a whole object in the frame for a viewer to get the idea. If there's enough information, the brain will fill in the rest, and that lets the viewer be engaged to complete the object. To be effective, be sure to cut off enough that it looks deliberate. If you clip off just a tiny bit of a tip or an edge, that will look like a mistake. So that's the end of the Gestalt principles. Now we're at point of view. Our natural tendency is to stand up, raise the camera horizontally to our eyes, and take the shot. But that's what everybody sees. You need to find other angles to get or garner interest. This picture looks as though you walked up to the edge, raised the camera, and just took this uninspiring image. By changing position, it gives you a whole different perception. And this is much more interesting. This is Pemaquid Lighthouse in Maine, and everybody climbs down these rocks to get this view. I decided I wanted a different view, so I climbed down in the front, where hardly anybody ever goes. On the left is a view that many people will see. On the right is one that hardly anybody will see. So it's great when you choose a perspective that people are not familiar with. Point of view has a tremendous effect on the feeling of your image. If you're shooting down on a person, it suggests a sense of dominance. When you're shooting children, get down on their level so the viewer can have an intimate view. Plus, you won't be so intimidating and you'll get more natural images. Now in this straight-on view, taken with the camera about chest height, it appears that the man in the center must have some significance because he's in the front and the others are in a row behind him. A more interesting view is this wormhole view. All these guys now seem to have superstar status. The bright lights, which could be distracting, reinforce the idea of them as superstars. They're in the spotlight. So translate this to a Thanksgiving dinner shot of your family around the table with the camera placed on the table at one end. You'll all look like superheroes. Here's a unique point of view from William Eggleston from about the 60s. Think how this would have looked if he had simply stood up and taken the shot. Along with how you position yourself for the shot is how you choose to frame it, horizontally or vertically. That'll give a totally different feeling to the story you're telling. Now in this horizontal shot, you sense how vast this area is and see how high up the guy is. But moving it to a vertical frame, you get a sense of horror, terror, because you see how really high up he is. Not sure which format to use? Well, take one and then take the other. So in our 3D world, we pick up visual clues to determine distance, but photos are two-dimensional. So we have to create a relationship between elements in the frame to create a sense of depth. Now first are converging lines. We all know that as parallel lines get farther away, they appear to come together. This gives us a sense of looking into the distance. Similar phenomenon is diminishing size. As objects get farther away, they appear to get smaller. Here it's trees, but think of telephone poles along the side of the road. You know they're all the same size, but in the distance, they appear to be quite a bit smaller. When one object overlaps another, it indicates that the object is in front, closer to you. This is obvious, but if you want to show depth, you can place something in the foreground in front of things that are farther back. When you're shooting an object of questionable size, place something of known size in front of it or with it. Without this man, you wouldn't know if this was a toy truck or a huge earth mover. This looks like a few small waves on the beach at your feet. But if you add a person to the picture, you see how wide and expanse it is. Two more concepts that convey depth are a gradual decrease of contrast or saturation. On the left, you see it progresses from dark at the bottom to light at the top, or a gradual decrease of focus on the right, from the top or the bottom of the image to the top. This is from atmospheric haze. A near-far relationship is a very effective way to show depth. For this to work, you need 3 layers of interesting information. The foreground is to capture the viewer's attention, the middle pulls the eye further into it, and then the background draws it all the way back. Many images fail because there's interest at one end or the other with nothing of interest in the other layers. This works best using a wide-angle lens and getting close to the foreground object so you can exaggerate its size compared to what's in the background. Now, an extension of the near-far relationship is forced perspective. For this, you create an optical illusion to make an object appear smaller or larger, like Godzilla the pigeon here. To be convincing, you usually need both foreground and background elements to be in focus so they appear to be on the same plane, no pun intended. You often see someone appearing to be holding up the Tower of Pisa, but I like this one better. I think it's pretty well done. A focal point and visual anchor can help to establish a center of interest when your subject is an idea or a concept. Here, the subject is the vastness and strangeness of Death Valley's racetrack. The rock is a focal point here. You notice it right away. Then you wander through the rest of the image, but ultimately you come back to that rock. It's a visual anchor. The light in the window provides a focal point here. In this somewhat chaotic scene, the woman in the orange coat at the lower left is the focal point. You notice her pretty quickly. Then you explore the rest of it to see what's going on, but ultimately you come back to her. As humans, we crave to understand. We want to know. If we can identify with an image, we better understand it. Jay Maisel, who's a prominent New York photographer known for gesture, was asked to explain it. He took a shot of a guy running his hand through his hair and said, "That's gesture." It was a moment that made the guy unique and interesting. So when you're taking a shot of a person, look for something that tells a viewer something about them, something that we can relate to. Here's a documentary shot that's special only to the people who know this kid. And incidentally, notice how the background is cluttered with things that we can recognize. The fence, human forms, white shoes, all taking attention away from the kid. This image should appeal to a much broader audience because it has gesture that will speak to most of us. You can tell that she's swinging the bat hoping to hit the ball, but she is scared to death. Look at her expression. We can relate to that. What takes this image out of the realm of documentary shot is the kid's stance and his thumbs up. Makes you wonder what happened. What's he responding to? Is he saying, "Yeah, we're the best," or "Yeah, we're ready"? If you ever played Little League ball or had to watch it, you know how boring it can be for the kids in the outfield. On the left, the kid is bored to tears. And on the right, he's pretending that something is coming his way. Those gestures give us a sense of being that kid, and we know how he feels. And the last thing is punctum. This is Latin for point. We are bombarded by images everywhere all the time, all day long. Most of them are easily forgotten, but there are a few that you'll remember. How about this image of the men raising the flag over Iwo Jima? Or this one of Dorothea Lange's image of a migrant mother and her kids. Punctum is an element that punctuates, punctuates the consciousness of the viewer. It jumps out and grabs you and makes you remember the scene. Unfortunately, this is not something you can orchestrate. It's an unexpected detail that affects us on a personal level, and it may be different for each viewer. This is the Marlboro Marine, taken in Iraq in 2004, I think, by a photojournalist named Louis Cinco. This shot shows how war can affect soldiers. You can see the vacancy and the sadness in his eyes. There is a video about this guy, and if you have time, you should check it out. There's also some fantastic images of the platoon by Cinco. Now, the rest of these are lighter of heart, and all four are by Elliot Erwitt. I love this shot. You've got this Great Dane, I assume, on the left, with legs as tall as the woman's, and then you got this dinky little Chihuahua with the bug eyes. That Chihuahua is something else. Here, check the look on the woman's face. Don't you wonder what she's thinking? How dare you take my picture, or something to that effect? And notice how the dog's fur echoes the woman's hair. And that one speaks for itself. So, a key to a memorable photograph is a good composition. Learning how to see and understanding composition requires study like any other craft. So forget rules, forget absolutes, and forget must. Instead, develop an awareness of these visual principles and learn how to use them. Learn these tools so they become second nature and you can use them intuitively, and you will have tremendous artistic power. Not everyone fits for every image, and there are several more that I haven't mentioned. But there is no perfect way to compose a photograph. It's all about experimenting constantly and finding what works best to convey your message. Art is not what you see, but what you make others see. Thank you. That's it. Okay.
All right, thank you, Lynn. I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody, and we'll open it up to questions from the floor. Everybody should be unmuting. Or not.
So Lynn, this is Steve. It was a fabulous presentation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
A lot of detail, very comprehensive. So my question is, if you were to advise us how to train our eye for good composition, you know, after tonight, like how would you advise us to, you know, become better at composition?
Well, if you want, you can have a, I can make a PDF of the presentation and then you can check those things out.
Period. I took copious notes and I'll be going over them again and again.
Didn't they record this?
Pardon?
Didn't they record? this
Oh, I don't know.
It was recorded. It will be available tomorrow morning with the access code you'll get in the email.
Okay, awesome. Maybe I'll send you, there's a couple things that in my notes, like the link to the Marlboro Marine, and there were a couple other things that I had more detail, thinking that somebody would read it later, but I'll see if I can put that together and send it to you. The thing is just, I mean, I touched on so many things tonight. You'll never remember them all. I mean, I've been researching this for years and trying to remember everything, but you know, I forget. Putting it into practice is tough. Just try to remember about balance, and to make sure that you check the frame to see what's there. So that would encompass whether you're cutting something off, whether the background is good or not. You know, that encompasses quite a bit. Does that answer your question?
No, it does. It's you know, it's I think over time, as you look at pictures and listen to videos and listen to good people like you, it becomes innate. I mean, your eye begins to see things differently.
Right, right.
So
And you know, there's a lot of videos out there. They're starting to not be as free as they were early on in this pandemic, but if you have time and the inclination, watch them. Anything by Ian Plant is phenomenal. Chris Knight is another good one. I think that's K-N-I-G-H-T. Some of the pictures were by those guys, and their names are in my presentation, so you should have those. But a couple things about, am I muted? No.
No.
Okay, it said I was. B&H Explora has a number of compositional videos that are free, and they're really good. So, Anything else?
Any other questions?
But shouldn't you look at other art forms like sculpture or maybe painting? Also, do some of the same similar concepts?
I would say painting. I don't know about sculpture. I don't really know anything about sculpture. But the thing that makes photography different is that we are starting with a full slate and we need to cull it down. Whereas painting, you're starting with a blank slate and building up. But yeah, the design concepts are the same. Anybody else?
Don't be shy.
I'm not muted anymore.
All right then.
Would you, I'm sorry, if I could just ask one more thing. Could you repeat those names of, there were a couple people that you suggested that we look into in terms of having some very good instruction about composition?
Yes. Ian Plant, and I see Howard just put that in the chat. It's IAN Plant.
Oh, thanks, Howard.
And the other guy is Chris, CHRIS, Knight, KNIGHT. Eileen Rafferty, RAFFERTY. You can find her on B&H. Yep. She's great. They're the ones that come to mind.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I like to think of myself as somebody who is able to do decent composition, but I have trouble expressing to other people like what, why this works. And so your presentation was wonderful for me because it gives me some language to use or think about using. So thanks so much.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad that I helped you out. Cool.
One of the more concise presentations, to the point and where you wanted to go. You didn't sit around on points. You kept moving. That was good.
Well, I knew I only had an hour, more or less. So, I mean, when I do a class, I have a lot more slides and more information, but that might take 2 hours, so couldn't do that.
Continue.
Hey, Rob, this is Steve. Can I do a selfish promotion?
Go for it.
Based on what Lynn said, the Maryland Photography Alliance in April, the Odyssey of Light seminar, we actually have Ian Plant as one of our speakers.
Oh, wow.
And hey, buckle your seatbelt. And Eileen Rafferty is the second speaker.
No way.
And I don't know if you know Stephen Johnson. He's a Canon Explorer of Light from California. So anyway, two of the people that you mentioned will be in Baltimore if it gets off the ground, with the virus and all that stuff.
Isn't that sold out?
It's sold out. We have a waiting list, but I would recommend, putting your name on the waiting list because people may drop out given the situation, and you can make a decision.
What are the dates on that, Steve?
Yeah.
What's that?
What are the dates on that?
October 17th. It's a Saturday.
Okay.
Yep.
Ian Plant was supposed to be at Harrisburg in April. They were going to have their light and creativity workshop, I think it was.
Yeah.
And Ian Plant was supposed to be there. So they're hoping, since they had to cancel it, to have them back in next year. So if yours gets canceled, there's always hope for next April.
Yeah, Ian's very good. I did a workshop with him in northern Minnesota. He's
Oh, wow.
great. Yeah, he's very good.
He just sent out an email that he was going to be in somewhere out west, like North Dakota and I forget, Montana. And if anybody wanted to tag along with him, they could, for a price, of course. Can you imagine? I mean, he goes out into the hinterlands.
Oh, wow. Well, speaking of workshops, I want to leave a little teaser here. More details on this will will come up soon over the next few days. I'll get it posted to Meetup. Coming in August, stay tuned for this. David Bleckman will be hosting for Hartford County Photography Group an in-person workshop in August in Haverty Grace. He will be live with a model. He will be teaching you how to properly pose, photograph, do portraits. This will be probably a group of about 10 or so. We're hoping a little more, but that'll be in August. And then a few days after that, he is actually going to do a Zoom for us and will actually take photos from that shoot and teach us how to properly edit portraits. So keep your eye out for that. That'll be posted to Meet Out pretty soon.
Cool.
Are there any other questions for Lynn?